This is your square.
Thank you.
So here we are on, from off the top of his head, he knows what he's saying.
Yeah, there's a little.
Phil Bonomo is a universal translator who is able to take ideas that are barely, I'm not saying half-baked or half-brained, but are just not quite ready for human consumption, and to interpret them so that there's a wow moment. And tell us about how you would take what we talked about this morning in any way you want to, and tell us how you would present this.
Well, it seems to me that if you've created a foundation whose purpose is to introduce a new way of thinking in such a way that we become less dependent upon the rampant evolution of technology,
Yeah.
and more dependent on our own, for lack of a better term, God-given abilities to think, to reach conclusions, to think differently. If that's what your foundation needs to be, it's not about trying to figure out who we're going to propose to get a $50 million prize, who we're going to propose to get a $100 million prize, who we're connected with. Those are all things that are, they're givens. But what we need to do is we need to take that, what is that core, and I call it a wow moment, when you can say to someone, and this is kind of like an elevator pitch, you can say to someone, the whole brain foundation is comprised of these individuals to do this. And that this has to be absolutely jaw-dropping. And if that this is not jaw-dropping, and it doesn't, and if it takes longer than 90 seconds to explain, you're going to lose people.
And the this that you heard this morning, from your point of view, give it a shot.
Well, the this I've heard from you is the fact that you are proposing a new way of essentially training the individual to use their mind in a much more amplified and enhanced fashion, so that we become, and this is my conjecture, so that we become less dependent upon all the machines that we're using, particularly these, and we become more dependent upon what we have up here to solve problems, to build relationships, to empower educational institutions, to further political thinking, to do things that right now all we do is we rely on the technology to provide us. Interesting aside. So my wife and I were talking just yesterday, and I was saying, geez, we've got all these tomatoes. I was talking to Jeanette about her tomatoes, because we have a neighbor who is having an abundant harvest of tomatoes. I don't know how she's doing it. And so we pick blueberries up in New Hampshire, where we have a place, and we trade blueberries for tomatoes. And so we've got this big box of tomatoes sitting in my kitchen. And I was saying to Shelley, I'd like to find a really nice recipe for gazpacho. I haven't had a good gazpacho in a long time. And what's our default? Our default is, let's Google gazpacho recipes. So that's just a very, very simple indication that we tend not to think about, let me problem solve what gazpacho is. Let me recall what gazpacho tasted like. Let me think about those ingredients. And let me use my mind to create a recipe, not the recipe, not the world's best recipe, because you can Google world's best recipe for gazpacho and you get like 10 of them. And that's just a function of search, But let
Or
me
10
create,
million.
Yeah, or 10 million. but let me create my own. Let me think differently about a recipe for a simple soup, and create that recipe myself using this as opposed to using this. And if we can get people to think about that, and this really gets down to problem solving. I mean, our ancestors did not have Google to figure out how do I make fire, and yet they made fire. Our ancestors did not have Google to determine maybe this meat that I've been consuming raw might taste a little better cooked. So we have examples throughout civilization of extreme problem solving, because that's an extreme solution. But we have become so complacent when it comes to using our own minds, and I see it in the kids these days, and we become lemmings. This is where social media. You were talking about social media before. I think 90% of social media is an absolute waste of time and dangerous. The 10% that you talk about finding people that are thinking similarly,
or maybe 1%.
It might be 1%. It might be 0.5%. But I think the majority of time that is spent on social media is an absolute waste of time, and I find myself questioning, what would we have done if we didn't have it? What would we have done as civilization if we didn't have it? We are wired to be problem solvers. We are wired to be creators, to make things, to do things, and to go down one road and see that road isn't going to work, so I back up, I go down the other road. And yet now what we've done is we've become very lazy to technology. So you give me an opportunity, you give some of these big thinking organizations an opportunity to think outside the box when it comes to technology, not to uncouple ourselves from technology, but rather to embrace technology only when it really is relevant, and to spend more time embracing the technology that's within. These have become training wheels. And so your computer, your internet, your social media, think about the way that the political landscape is today. It's not about one candidate being better than the other. It's about this lemming effect that social media has had on the population. And so if I hear a particular thing that a particular candidate is saying, and it resonates with me, I'm listening to a 15-second soundbite. I have no context whatsoever, and yet I'm reacting to it, and I'm adhering to it, and I'm jumping on board with it. That's no way to live. We have to be problem solvers. We were talking about boot camp earlier, and one of the things I learned as my son went through boot camp, he's a Marine, as he went through boot camp, the ultimate goal of boot camp, because they're completely uncoupled from technology, the ultimate goal of boot camp is there are two. One is be true to yourself, in solving problems, in dealing with challenges, and the other one is be dependent and reliant on your peers. Peer compatibility and having peers move together is something that in a lot of respects we've lost, because we use this as the interim step. And if we can get people to think more and think collectively without being connected at the hip with technology, I think we'll be better off. And that's an idea, that's $1 million idea, that's a $10 million idea, if we can get people to think that way.
Phil, that's just terrific. And you have really captured, in a way that I could understand what you were saying, and it resonated with what I'm trying to do. I just want to add a couple more things to it. And that is, as humanity has focused on the essential life force of creativity, that creativity is really the mother of all processes, of problem solving, of teaching, of learning, of negotiating, of doing a clinical trial, you name it. That to the extent that that becomes such a fundamental dimension, that the other two dimensions, your peers, the rest of humanity, how you work with humanity, and then how humanity and creativity have generated all this technology. Essentially, the technology was built by reverse engineering humanity. Mm-hmm. We took a person and made a robot. Mm-hmm. We took a hand signal and a voice and turned it into an iPhone.
Right.
So that now that we have gotten to the point that our creativity has allowed us to reverse engineer humanity, mm-hmm. to create technology, we've been able to generate what represents kind of a platonic ideal essence of humanity embodied in technology. Mm-hmm. And we can see it for the first time. It's not the same. A bird is not an airplane, but an airplane has a lot of characteristics that are similar to a bird. And an iPhone isn't a mind or a brain, but it has had to compute it. So if you look at the iPhone as the example of technology, mm-hmm. with its computer processor, it's about to be equal to 100 billion neurons in the brain. The opposite member of the iPhone's chip processor is the brain. Mm-hmm. The opposite member of the operating system on top of the brain mm-hmm. is the mind. Mm-hmm. And the opposite thing for all those apps that you have that you can't keep track of, that turn out to be, when you use them, are very useful, is the behavior of the body. Mm-hmm. And so what we are looking to do at the Whole Brain Foundation is to come up with a three-dimensional conceptual framework, like the alphabet, like numbers, like Arabic numerals, like checklists, like the Bible, all these memory palaces and pathways that we have that we use as our framework, and use design thinking to create a whole new mind, so that literally we will be able to think about thinking in a new way and have a tangible way of looking at that. Rogerio, would you get the cube? The tangible way that I've looked at it is to take a Rubik's Cube with a 5 by 5 by 5 dimension mm-hmm. and visualize that. I started off with a 3-dimensional, mm-hmm. but this Rubik's Cube, I envisioned it as a way of thinking about your mind, mm-hmm. where this axis here, left brain to right brain, is humanity. Mm-hmm. With Roger Sperry's work in the 80s. This direction here is limbic to cerebral. Mm-hmm. Paul MacLean's work. And the integration of the left to right, limbic to cerebral, was Ned Herman's 2-dimensional model of the whole brain.
Right.
What we're adding is the 3rd dimension, from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, mm-hmm. as the creative process that goes from the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, mm-hmm. the optical lobes of the eyes, mm-hmm. and thinks about brain waves from the delta wave, the theta wave, the alpha wave, the beta wave, the gamma wave, and tries to, and I believe we are succeeding in building an integrated view mm-hmm. of how this cube, as the first instantiation, can be a visualization of the mind that gives people a way to think about it, instead of saying that I got to think better. They need something tangible.
Right.
What do you say to that?
We could try.